I left my flat in the afternoon and made my way to Patrick's, where I found him eating soup at a table full of assembled children of varying ages. His 8, 9, 10 siblings? I'd lost count after the last baby. In all reality, the 3 older after him were from his blood father, who had died on the job serving the watch when Patrick was still quite a young man. After several years of struggling, his mother had remarried a decent fellow, factory man, and went back to creating more children. Patrick did not seem to mind, although a great deal of his pay went to helping support them. The younger all idolized him to epic, heroic proportions to which Patty spent a great deal of time and energy living up to. He could be ruthlessly competitive about his reputation as a white knight in the city, or at least to his family, and would vehemently argue any smirch upon his standing. His mother let me in, and I was immediately poured a coffee, and awaited Patrick to finish his dinner. "Oi, you early tills," he shouted as he squinted at his ancient pocket watch, yet another inheritance from his father, along with his sword, pistol, and leather gloves with the watch emblem sewn in. "No, you just forgot we were going to stop at the library before we clock in, mate," I reminded him as I sipped the piping hot beer drink, swishing in the chipped mug his mother had handed me. His eyes widened as he remembered, and he immediately took his soup bowl in both hands and tipped it back with 2 gulps and dabbed his red beard with a cloth. Standing, he began kissing heads and saying goodbyes before hugging his mother and promising to be safe as he did every day. Once more, as the sun began to settle behind the distant buildings and smokestacks, climbed the great stone stairs and past the pillars of the library. You know, it's funny. I've never barely set my foot in the library for years, and now it seems like we hang out there all the time. Very true, I agreed, and forced myself to acknowledge that we were visiting Eldon more and more frequently, and it grew harder to excuse our visits in a subsequently professional reason. We found him once more seated at the great table by lamplight, completely engrossed in some giant book as he scribbled away in his notes. "What is it today, gentlemen? Another horrid murder?" I winced a little at the joke, as the murders had become more than a sore subject. After the past weeks, everyone from crime bosses to magistrates and businessmen had been found in the same shape as Malmander, gutted with their flesh ripped away, and done with a supernatural ease. "Not tonight. We went down to Plague Town last night," Patrick quickly offered. Eldon did not look up, which prompted me to carefully lift the huge leather cover and read the title of the book. "Dark Tales of the Elves," I said out loud. "I think all the old tales of the elves were pretty dark, mate," Patrick laughed as I gazed onto the text. "Exactly." Eldon did not look up, and I could see that he was utterly absorbed in his subject. "Isn't that like a bunch of children's stories?" Patrick said, now staring at the text upside down. "I think my little sisters read this before bed." "They are considered by some as such, but this is a collection of all that is known of the Elvish histories and their own stories. This is the closest thing I could find to actual historical information about them as a species and culture. It is truly almost always very grim stories. They had a pretty rough time of it, I gather." "That's an understatement if I ever heard one," Eldon answered, as he sat up, removed his glasses, and rubbed his eyes wearily. "Religious and political turmoil, war, and eventually a plague that more or less finished them off. But they were all magical and whatnot, right? One with nature and all that." I had heard very little of these people. I was a bit more familiar with the tales of the Northerners called the Hulda folk, who may or may not have been an offshoot of the same people, but were so vastly different in philosophy and action that most historians always cast them separate. Yes, very much so, but it didn't really help in the end. There was something horrible and wretched that happened between the humans and them. I remember my sister crying when Mom read it to her. "Why are you so interested in elves now, Eldo?" I asked. I still had his attention. "Was it what that Fisher guy said?" "Yes, well, maybe, but never mind that now. Did you say that you went to Plague Town?" "Yeah, well, I patrol Plague Town quite a bit, but I brought Till down there with me so I'd have proof of this damn demon monster thing I saw. Whoa, what demon monster? Now we had his interest. One of the nastiest creatures you can imagine, like straight out of the old stories. When I saw it, I thought I'd lost my mind, so I brought a witness to confirm. And did you see this thing, Tilly? No, but honestly, we couldn't get past the ghost of the Athenda priestess. She does not like watchmen, Patrick said thoughtfully. Indeed, she did not, I agreed. So, Patrick began counting on his fingers. We either need to 1, get rid of her, 2, make her go away, or 3, get her to like us a lot more. Can you do any of that? How lucid was she? Eldon now leaned forward on his elbows with interest shining on his features. Oh, very much so, I said plainly. She had some rather strong opinions on the Watch and historical events, Patrick added. I bet she did, Eldon smiled as he slowly closed the giant tome. Is there a chant or a rune or something for any of that? I've explained this before. I am far from being an expert on ghosts. There is basically nothing I can do to help unless you want to get a good night's sleep, have a good turn of luck, or maybe open a log. Well, we could definitely use a good turn of luck. Patrick had began nosing through the stack of books. I have also told you that I cannot just give you luck. It took me weeks of study and rituals to bring a change to the direction of chance. Yeah, well, we just hoped maybe roaming this library all day might have given you some bit of knowledge or whatnot. I mean, what exactly are you studying here? Bedtime stories? What that Fisher guy said really got to me. I've always wondered about my heritage. Have you guys been watching him? Yeah, the boat's still at the dock, Patrick answered. But have you been watching him? Eldon had that quizzical look as if he already knew the answer. Well, we've had our eyes on him, I said, this realizing he was about to embarrass us considerably. They've opened up a shop in Midtown, gentlemen. Have you not noticed that they have purchased a building and opened an agency of sorts? You're joking. Patrick hung his head. Not in the least. They have rented the old jewelry company warehouse on Spindle Street, right next to the shops and the bank. There is a sign reading the Stoneland Metaphysical Society hanging over the sidewalk. You had no idea. He was laughing considerably. Well, that's not our area, I mumbled in an attempt to ease the sting of this news. It was in the paper, he burst forth as he stood and grabbed his coat, bag, and long grey scarf. Where are you going? I asked as he slipped the large storybook into his bag. Well, you need help with a ghost, and that is exactly what they offer. I suggest we go in for a consultation and see what they say. You just want more information from that Fisher bloke, Patrick quipped as he followed him out. Perhaps, but I'm also curious about this whole situation. I grinned at him in wonder. Eldon Bleak was a man terrified by danger and the supernatural, who was also fascinated, if not mildly addicted, by both danger and the supernatural. We had discovered that if there was anything that could keep him away from the game tables at night, it was the opportunity to engage in something risky. All right, mate. But we need to be at work in 2 hours, Patrick reminded. But Eldon could care less. A brief walk in the cold dusk later, and we stood outside the windows of the old building, which had, until 5 years ago, been a primary source of jewelry manufacturing and sale to the upper echelon of the city. After being robbed numerous times, the owner had given up and left the building empty until now. The Stoneland Metaphysical Society Agency Headquarters, I read out loud, studying the impressive sign. Remind me, Patrick began as he looked at Eldon. Why do they call it Stoneland? Because originally, for centuries, it was called the Land of Stones, he answered. But as it modernized and became a unified country, they called it Stoneland. Why? Big rocks, he laughed quietly. He enjoyed a little more than mocking us to our faces. Seriously, I chastened. I am serious, mate. The whole country is this vast expanse of rocky moors and dark forests, but long ago, there was some kind of king or another who began excavating and moving these huge rocks cut from the Dark Mountain and assembled them all over the countryside in these terrific stone rings and altars. The Dark Mountain. Patrick snapped his fingers in revelation. I know that one. That's the big mountain in the southeast that was supposed to be cursed. Very good, Mr. Valance. You are correct. There's a whole story about it in Dark Tales. The Dark Mountain was a horrid place. His people lived inside deep caves that were said to be infected with demonic magic. A king was tricked into moving the stones to his own country by a bride who came from the mountain. But the Dark Mountain is real, I pondered. There's towns there and people on the border of a big reserve area around the mount. Oh yes, it's all quite historically accurate, I believe. The Stonelands now have quite a reputation for supernatural events and the paranormal, as does the mountain. I assume that Fisher's partners are from that territory. However, we will not know until we go in. There was a bell on the door that rang as we entered. The air inside was warm and smelled of cigar smoke and incense. There was a large desk before us where a young man sat typing. He was dressed impeccably and reeked of cologne as his thin fingers pounded away on the machine. "We're about to close, gentlemen," he said without even looking up. These men are from the Watch," Eldon said in the strangely suggestive but outwardly friendly way he had. They were hoping to perhaps get a brief consult before closing. This brought an immediate look from the man, who looked from me to Patrick quickly and intensely. Yes, we were told you might be stopping in." He now stood and rushed towards us with a very immediate change in character. "Told by whom?" I asked as he shook my hand. "Why, Mr. Fisher, of course." "Is he the boss, then?" Patrick asked as his hand was pumped up and down frantically as well. "Boss? No, there is no boss. We have a board of trustees who act as a council through which decisions are made. There is no one person here who has complete authority over anything. Mr. Fisher is a lead member, though. You might call him a head chairman, so to speak." "And what exactly is your business?" Patrick asked, drawing a stunned look from the man. "Why, we are a paranormal consultation and investigative entity. Do you not read the paper, sir? I believe we deserved that last statement in all of its snide reality." "They missed it," Eldon countered. "They've been very busy." Once again, Eldon's dulcet tones seemed to sweep over the young secretary's suspicious and doubts and cool his sarcasm. I truly wondered how much was Eldon and how much was his little trick. "Well, then all must be forgiven. It would be silly of me to assume that the City Watch has time to sit around reading the papers all night." Eldon coughed, and we stood in silent humiliation. "So is Mr. Fisher here?" Patrick asked quickly, changing the conversation. "I don't rightly know if he left yet or not. I will go check and inform him of your presence. Have a seat, gentlemen." He gestured to the expensive leather couches and chairs in the waiting area. I spotted the cigars and almost leapt over the others. We must have looked like street urchins, having just been let in out of the cold as we merely sniffed the cigars and began to smoke, but expensive cigars for us were a rare treat indeed, and that was before we even spotted the brandy and snifters on the table nearby. I was painfully aware that our class was showing, but at the same time too excited to care much. "Aren't you two planning on going to work?" Eldon asked as we filled the glasses. I stopped for a moment and looked thoughtfully at Patrick as I awaited his response. "A couple nips here and there for warmth won't hurt," he replied without shame. I mean, we do spend most of our time wandering in the cold. Brandy warms the blood, mate. This seemed to satisfy Eldon, as he too reached for a pour. The young secretary returned shortly and glanced at all of us nervously for some unknown reason. Ah, good. You found the brandy and cigars. Delightful. I'll show you to the boardroom. You can bring the drinks. We quite merrily stood and followed towards two great sliding doors, which he opened and presented us to what might have been a factory room for assemblage, but now was a vast space with an enormous table with close to a dozen chairs and a large pin board in the front, which I saw only for a second before I watched Fisher cover it in a cloth. I could have sworn it was covered in scribbled notes and newspaper clippings joined by strands of red string pinned into various placings. Fisher was dressed similarly as before, but in a more expensive dark purple waistcoat. Standing with him was a shorter, older man with a wild shock of snow-white hair and beard, reminiscent of the man named Dobrias, who we had met at the docks, and they may have been related. In difference, though, he had a very sharp pointed nose which stuck out from a great wild mustache. Perched on this nose sat a thick round set of spectacles which greatly exaggerated the size of his clear blue eyes. He seemed very small and slight, but it was difficult to determine as he wore a thick patchwork combination of coats and a long scarf. Seated next to him at the vast table was a young woman dressed in a shawl of bright red, with a blue and green golden inlaid dress underneath. Her long dark hair was tied in a scarf over a pale, lovely face with shining, inquisitive blue eyes. She reminded me distinctly of the travelers who arrive in spring for the street carnivals, but her hands were laden with bright, shining rings and bracelets of precious metals, and hanging from her long neck were numerous necklaces of various design. She looked at us, and I was immediately under the impression we could hide nothing from her. There would be no subterfuge. With her, all would be laid bare. Taken aback by either of these possibilities. "Ah, nothing like that, sir," Patrick said respectfully, and he, like I, seemed to be put off slightly by the young woman. There definitely was a palpable feeling of being seen in her presence. The older man seemed curious, but in no way interested, beyond perhaps a slight annoyance. "Actually," Eldon stepped forward, and I could see he was not as off guard as he had been on the dock. He had been thinking about this man and wanting something. "They've come to ask you for a consultation." Fisher's brow furrowed for a moment, as if he were having difficulty accepting this, and glanced at the woman, who smiled slightly and nodded to him. I had the strong impression that she had just given us the okay. "Really?" He smiled a bit, and his sharp, pointed teeth were visible for a moment, which made him appear somewhat sinister. I reminded myself that this was probably not intentional, but jarring all the same. "Well, if there is anything I can do to assist the city, then of course I am not only willing but interested, gentlemen of the watch," he said, gesturing to the small, scruffy man with a great mass of wild hair and enormous bald forehead. "This is my partner, Ludwig Kettleburn, who is the brother of the Mr. Dobrias who you met before." The man gestured somewhat nervously. "And this also is one of our partners, Lemora." The woman nodded gently with her hands folded calmly on the table before her. "If I'm no longer needed, then may I—" began the secretary as he backed towards the door. "You may leave, of course, Lion. Thank you." He quickly nodded to us as he swiftly left, and Fisher motioned for us to sit. "Sir," Patrick said as he sat down, "how many partners do you have?" "There are 8 of us altogether." "That's incredible," Eldon said, oddly, his interest showing very clear in his pale eyes. All of you gifted, he added, and for a moment I could not fathom his line of thought. Noticing our expressions, he explained, "They're mediums, spiritualists." "Oh, not exactly, young man," the man named Ludwig corrected with a scowl. "Not all of us are so gifted, as you say. Much more so than his brother. His accent was thick and northern and unmistakably of the Commonwealth. "We all have gifts," the woman named Lemora answered softly, her own voice having a lilt, which, although foreign, I did not recognize. "However, they are not all of a spiritual nature." "Yes," Fisher laughed as he patted Ludwig's shoulder as if to reassure him. "Ludwig is an amazing scientist, researcher, engineer, and investigator." This seemed to cool Ludwig's flame as he smiled as if he were embarrassed of his outburst. "However, Lemora is, as you might say, a medium. She has many abilities and skills she has acquired over the years of this work. Ludwig, Lemora, these are investigators Sistine and Valance, of whom I told you, who came to the river weeks ago. I do not know the name of their companion." He looked at Eldon, who was staring at Lemora as if she was mostly fascinating. Not as if he was smitten by her beauty, which was as Patrick and I were trying to disguise poorly, but as if he had just went to the city zoo and found a unicorn on exhibit. "My name is Eldon," he offered, as if snapping from a trance. Eldon Bleak, sir." He looked back at Fisher, who in turn was studying him. "And you are not a member of the Watch?" Lemora said quietly. No, ma'am. I am what you might call a consultant." His words were carefully chosen, as I was sure he also had the feeling that he were as clear as a glass to this woman. "A consultant on the paranormal," she added without asking. I wondered how much she already knew, just from this meeting. Did she already guess that we had suspected Fisher of being the murderer in our city? From the way she studied us, I felt she did. "And you've come to ask us for help with something paranormal." This was a statement masquerading as a question. "Mr. Fisher had mentioned that your group was here in the city in order to study the ghosts," Patrick interrupted. "We believe that we have a situation which might qualify to pique your interest." He began to tug his beard, and his green eyes twinkled as he did when he thought he was negotiating a good deal. He was refusing to be made uncomfortable by her strange, silent scrutiny. If she had wanted to see his mind, then he was more than willing to show it, and indeed, her look became one of mild but noticeable surprise. "What would you need of us?" Fisher had reclaimed a half-smoked cigar from a nearby ashtray and was preparing to relight it. His interest was caught. "Are you familiar with the history of the city?" Patrick asked, before sipping the amber liquid. "We have been trying to educate ourselves," Ludwig spoke earnestly. "Do you know about Plague Town?" Eldon asked. "Somewhat," Fisher answered. Eldon glanced at us almost as if to ask permission, and we knew that he was going to tell the story of the plague and the watch. We sat quietly as he gave a quick and incredibly polite version of the story. As many times as I've heard it told, I've never heard it be more flattering to the watch as of yet. "That's horrifying," Lemora whispered. "To have to do such a thing." She looked at us, and I felt such gratitude for her compassion. She might have won us all over together then. I had to remind myself that words and sympathy were quite easy to produce. However, I could almost swear I saw a slight dewing of her eyes, as if perhaps a tear had been produced. Fisher and Ludwig looked on, shaking their heads sadly. And is this the source of this ghost? Ludwig questioned. It was a bit more than a ghost, Patrick explained carefully. He was going to risk seeming crazy by discussing the creature, but I, like him, realized that if we hid anything, we might quite easily lose their support and destroy whatever rapport we may have built. I followed a criminal to a ruined chapel, and I saw him and his group killed horribly by a thing. A thing? Fisher looked slightly confused and looked at Lemora, whose eyes were wide as if she may be glancing at a memory from Patrick's mind. The most wretched and horrible-looking nightmare that I could ever not even imagine with my own mind. He looked from one face to another. Describe this creature, Ludwig said, now taking a black notebook from within his coat and producing a pencil, with which he immediately started scribbling. Patrick then gave the same description I had heard him utter only a few times before, but for some reason I only now, for the first time, was actually hearing and imagining this creature as if it were real. Up until now, I had held back belief with a certain denial, and had not given my mind to envisioning this thing. But now, there was something about the quality of their attention. They were not doubting Patrick. This was something that they felt might be real. And if it was real, then I had refused to confront it even in my mind, let alone in that chapel. Have you ever heard of such a thing? I asked after he had finished. Yes, indeed, Ludwig answered instantly and looking up at me as if I were foolish for asking. Ludwig is somewhat of an expert on these things. Fisher paced back and forth across the room in a cloud of cigar smoke. As much as anybody is an expert on such things, Lemora added thoughtfully. What in the great high spirits kind of a thing is it? Patrick was excited and empowered that finally someone might believe his horror that he had carried all these weeks. To know he may not be mad was such that a wave of relief had washed over him. I would think it would be obvious, Ludwig commented as he wrote. Demonic, of course. This brought the heaviest silence of the conversation. All speechless. Demonic, Eldon said under his breath. But that's just stories. Realizing how it sounded, I still said it. So are ghosts, Fisher said without spite, and yet, here you sit. There are a great many things which once existed that drifted to the edges of our reality, Lemora explained. They have always been there, and they have always been dangerous, even if they are forgotten and denied. And you say that there is a ghost as well. Ludwig looked up and glanced at Fisher as if silently conveying something. A lucid ghost, which you felt might be connected to this creature. Lemora too shared this same glance with the two men. We must see these things, Ludwig announced, standing as if he were leaving this instant. Patrick looked stunned, and I quickly realized that he had not actually thought this would happen. I can take you there. We need to go to work. We've got to get to headquarters first. I desperately attempted to interject some normalcy. Can you bring us there tonight? Ludwig's tone had become intense. I guess we can. Patrick was stunned. All of us? Eldon seemed as dumbstruck as we were. Ludwig and Lemora will go with you and perform field reconnaissance so that we know what we face. Fisher was not asking. That is, if they agree. Of course, Ludwig nodded. Absolutely fascinating. Lemora looked intrigued. We looked at Eldon, who was not answering. Eldon? Patrick looked imploringly. Yes, of course. His voice was breaking and nervous. Sounds like fun. Should, Annis go, in case things become complicated, Lemora suggested. She's out running errands with Tobias again, Ludwig answered. But I believe Ravnisa is upstairs in her room. She may be willing to go with us. Lemora nodded as if this was an acceptable substitute, and I wondered what Annis or Ravnisa had or could do that they felt might be necessary. Based on our previous experience with Annis, I could only guess it was size and firepower. I will go ask her. She may be in the mood for a jaunt through town. You know how bored she gets. Ludwig walked and into the lobby before disappearing into the darkness of the building. Tilly! Patrick suddenly burst forth as he gazed at his pocket watch in terror. We've got to go now! We're going to be late again and the captain will hang us. You two go, and I will show them to Plague Town, Eldon offered, but we had already begun apologizing as we rushed to the door. Thank you so much, Mr. Fisher. Patrick stopped and spun around before stepping back into the cold. It has been a pleasure to meet you, I added, nodding to Lemora, who seemed amused by our buffoonery. We'll try to get there as soon as we can, Patrick yelled as I heard the ring of the bell and quickly ran to catch up. I took one last look over my shoulder at Eldon and for a moment wondered if perhaps we should not leave him alone with these strangers. They did not seem to be overtly dangerous, but at the same time, there was that impression of something sinister about Fisher, which I choose to blame upon my own prejudice. I had never met anyone so unusual, and I could not deny my innate bias. We made to the watch house, as our headquarters downtown was called. The desk sergeant signed us in, and we went to the shift meeting, carefully keeping our distance from our captain, should the brandy linger on our breath. There was a long, grinding lecture concerning the killings, as he brandished several of the papers, with headlines brutally declaring the entire militia as incompetent. The captain was an older man with a large leather mask over half of his face, which covered a gruesome scarring from what was said to be both a misfiring musket by some and a massive rabid sewer rat by others. None knew for truth, but the result of this incident was a severe injury to his entire left side, including the loss of 3 fingers and a very stiff arthritic limp. Despite his appearance, his voice was loud, clear, and commanding, as his manner stern and intimidating. His message was clear. We were to do everything in our power to end the murderous reign of this killer in our city. Many of these victims were of high society, and any assault of that class would not be tolerated. I wondered how much would defer if it were the poor who were preyed on. There had been a few criminals slain as well, and I would wager gold that wheels were turning in the underworld of the city to find the culprit. We were given our assignments, and I was relieved to see my beat would be close to Patrick's, near the Plague Town, so I would not have to shirk my patrol as such to accompany him. The gas lamps in the street were being lit as we jogged along towards the river, light snow once more flaking around us in the darkness. We soon arrived at the small watchtower, which had been built on the street barricade long ago over a locked gate opening into the quarantined areas. The others of the society group in Eldon were nowhere to be seen. We climbed the ladder into the small outpost shack, where we gathered our lanterns and then heard the sound of horses coming down the street. A carriage pulled up, and as we watched, Eldon and 3 others stepped from inside. This was Lemora, wrapped in a great blue fur-lined cloak, and beside her, almost complete antithesis in her appearance, was who I assumed was the one known as Ravnisa. If I had expected someone like Annis, I was also very wrong. She was quite small, only being a few inches taller than the most diminutive Ludwig. She stood beside Lemora in a long, black, also fur-lined cloak, with the cowl pulled up as if she were the other woman's small shadow. Even as we stood before them, there was little that could be seen of her face but for a small, pale chin, straight line of a mouth, and long, straight black hair, blowing beneath the hood. There was the impression of equipment of some sort belted beneath the cloak, which I assumed, based on experience with Annas, to be weapons. Ludwig sported an enormous top hat on his wild head of hair and was laden with a heavy satchel and carried some sort of device hanging like a brown wooden box around his neck. To me it resembled a camera, though I had never seen one so small before, as often they are set on wooden legs and quite awkward. The white-bearded man also wore a large pair of leather-strapped goggles instead of the spectacles from before. Standing before them in the street, I suddenly realized how uncomfortable this assemblage was without the presence of Mr. Fisher to preside over conversation, once more reminding me of the man's particularly professional, authoritative quality. Eldon, having spent more time with them, tried his best and introduced the shadowy Ravnissa, even though she said nothing, but only stood silent and still. "Lead the way, gentlemen," Ludwig announced in a friendly way. "I admit I am almost excited to see what might wait. I've not seen phenomena as you have described for some time." "Goodness, Ludwig," Lemore cautioned with a smile. "The phenomena is very dangerous and should be taken seriously." Of course, he chortled. "I will of course observe every precaution should danger rear itself." Patrick had opened the gate, and we entered, and this time I felt somewhat optimistic, as if perhaps we could in fact find some answer to the strangeness. I had tried to imagine explaining to the captain the situation at the chapel, and felt almost physically ill at the very thought. Now it seemed as if there was indeed someone who could help us in this strange endeavor. We came upon the chapel, and soon with little conversation but for an occasional comment from Patrick. That was the butcher shop and that the grocer's. I'm not sure, but I guess that one a cobbler. Climbing the steps to the chapel door, we found the door still open and swinging slightly in the winter wind. Nothing but darkness. Patrick and I went first. In true watch fashion, as we honestly had a sense of responsibility for these people. If anything were to happen to them, guilt would weigh heavily on me, and I warned Patrick as well. As the light of the lantern drove back the darkness, we saw the chapel interior just as we had left it. The statue of Athenda still loomed near the front, residing over the ruined altar and rotted pews with a skyward pointed spear. Snow blew in through the cavernous hole in the ceiling, and for a moment I thought perhaps we might just enter and make our way to the adjacent door, as if the ghost maybe was busy. It wouldn't notice us on this night. It was only after the entire group had entered that I once more felt that familiar wave of cold, buzzing excitement, as all my hair stood on end and my hands began sweating in my gloves. A light had begun to shine over us from a pinpoint star in the air over our heads, and as soon as we had noticed it, already it was enhanced, until there was a shining, blue-white sphere. The glowing orb sparkled with a wondrous beauty, as there was a sound of a small explosion and flash from the floor. I glanced down to see that it was Ludwig, who I guessed was photographing the event. There was a strange crank on the side of the wooden box he carried, which he was hurriedly turning with harsh metallic grind. It was only moments later, and another blast of light issued from the side of the device, and I realized that it was a flash, and even more so astonishing, he was already taking another picture. Before our eyes, the orb had increased in size and was transforming into the shape of a figure, flowing white robes. The ghost of the priestess was amongst us, and in my peripheral, I saw the dark shape of Ravnissa lean in and excitedly say something to Ludwig while gesturing at something behind the ghost. It seemed as if she were pointing at the statue. I looked back, and there was the forlorn menacing stare of the spirit before me. "Why?" the ghost said solemnly. "Why would you do such a thing?" It was as if she was speaking directly to me. I could only stare in stunned silence as Patrick held out his hands before him to express this same sentiment of sullen wonder. "Why would you return?" Why would you bring more? Why would you endanger them all?